Hello, hello. Welcome to the first episode of the Unshadowed podcast. To kick off the start of this podcast and the month of all things spooky, October, I'm going to be talking about a case that is honestly so terrifying and one that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough. And when it does seem to get talked about, it's never really taken seriously. So I want to kind of dive in and take a look at the murder of Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was born in Dallas, Texas on January 24th, 1943. So she was an Aquarius, and I definitely get that energy from her. She, at least as an adult, seemed very free, very open and loving, and I can definitely see some Aquarian energy in the way that she carries herself. Sharon would be 77 years old today. However, her life was cut tragically short when she was only 26 years old. Sharon came from a typical family. Her dad was a colonel in the U.S. Army, and she was the oldest of three sisters. So it was her, and then she had two younger sisters. Sharon seemed to be destined for the spotlight from a very young age, even though her parents didn't necessarily set out hoping that their daughter would have a career in show business. But when she was only 6 months old, Sharon was entered into the Miss Tiny Tot Dallas pageant, and she won first place. Since she came from a military family, Sharon had spent a lot of her younger years moving around, since her father had been promoted at different times and transferred to various military towns. By the time she was 16, Sharon had lived in half a dozen different cities. I also moved around a ton as a child, and I can definitely tell you that this takes a toll on a person, especially a young girl who's trying to step into who she is and someone who's starting to develop their self-image. It can make it really difficult to always be transitioning in life because it doesn't leave you a lot of space to focus on yourself and who you are and who you're becoming, because you're always having to adapt to new places, a new home, new school, new people. And this was definitely the case for Sharon. Her family has reported that it was really difficult for her to make friends and maintain friendships growing up because she was always moving, and she was also known as the new girl everywhere she went, and that can be really difficult. Her family has also said that Sharon was really shy and insecure growing up, and again, I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that she was constantly having to start over, and it can be really difficult to meet people and feel secure when you're having to do this. Being shy and insecure is something that followed Sharon into her adult life, and people often had a tendency to confuse her shyness with almost like a stuck-up attitude. And I get how people might mistake someone being shy and reserved as them kind of being aloof. But that's also something I used to struggle with, and when people would perceive my shyness as something else, it was always really frustrating for me because I just wanted to be like, no, I'm nice, I'm just really shy, It's not that I'm stuck up, it's that I'm quiet and I don't really know how to talk to people. And so that's something that Sharon struggled with. But luckily, once people got to know Sharon, they realized that she wasn't stuck up, she was just shy, and once they got to know her, then they could see that she was a really kind, warm-hearted, sweet person. As Sharon began to age into a young woman, people started to notice how unbelievably beautiful she was, and she really was just such a natural beauty. Eventually, as people kept telling her how beautiful she was, she started entering into beauty pageants, and in 1959, she actually won the Miss Richland pageant in Washington. From there, Sharon really hoped to go on to study psychiatry, and she even wanted to enter into the Miss Washington pageant that was taking place the following year. But before she could do that, her father was given orders, and he and the family relocated to Italy. At one point, a photo of Sharon was featured in the military newspaper Stars and Stripes. It was a picture of her in her bikini from one of her pageants, and this gave her a bit of a celebrity status amongst her peers. In Italy, Sharon was surrounded by people she considered to be friends for the first time in her entire life. At school, she met other students who weren't native to Italy, and so they all kind of found unity in each other because they each felt so isolated and separate from their old lives that it was kind of nice to be around people who also felt the same way. Sharon and her new friends landed roles as extras in the movie Hemingway's Adventure of a Young Man. This is where Sharon met Richard Beymer, and he was an actor in the movie. He noticed her on set and immediately took note of how beautiful she was. The two dated during the filming and the production of their movie, and this is what really sparked Sharon's future in the film industry, because Richard would tell her all of the time that she should pursue a career as an actress. In 1960, Sharon was featured in an episode of the Pat Boone Chevy Showroom, and since she worked for Pat Boone, this kind of gave her an in, and she was able to obtain the role. Sharon then went on to be an extra in the movie Barabbas, and she was noticed by Jack Palance. I'm sorry, I'm going to get some of these pronunciations wrong. Just bear with me. So she was noticed by Jack Palance during the movie. But since her role in Barabbas was pretty small and Jack couldn't really gauge her ability to act from that role, he set up a screen test for her so she could kind of showcase her ability to act. However, this was kind of a dead end, and it didn't really lead anywhere for Sharon. Sharon went back to the United States, but this only lasted briefly because her mother was actually so concerned for Sharon's safety that she suffered a nervous breakdown. So this led Sharon to move back to Italy. That was until 1962, when the entire family returned to the United States and Sharon moved to Los Angeles. Once she arrived in LA, Sharon contacted Richard Beymer's agent, and they arranged a time when they could meet. This was a really smart move because the agent, Harold Grefsky, took Sharon on as a client, and he was able to land her some decent-sized roles in television and magazines. In 1963, Sharon was signed to a 7-year contract with Filmways Incorporated. Sharon missed out on a few roles because she didn't quite have the confidence that the directors were looking for, and this kind of became a problem for her throughout her career. So she was given some smaller roles, and the concept was that hopefully these smaller roles would help her become a more secure actress, maybe make her more confident, and then once she was ready, she could handle some bigger roles. She took on smaller projects such as Mr. Ed and a small role in the Beverly Hillbillies. And around this time, Sharon met a man who would later become her fiancé. His name was Felipe, and he was also an actor. However, their relationship was said to be pretty toxic, and they fought very frequently. A few people have stated that because they were both rising actors and kind of having to deal with the pressure of trying to make a name for themselves in Hollywood, it took a toll on their relationship. And I could definitely see how that would be the case. It probably added a lot of tension into the relationship. So in 1964, their engagement was called off, and later that year, Sharon met Jay Sebring. He was working as a well-known hairstylist at the time, and the two began a relationship. When Jay proposed to Sharon, she turned him down because despite saying that he was a wonderful man and a really gentle person with a kind demeanor, Sharon planned to stop acting once she became married, and she wasn't quite ready to trade in her acting roles to take on the role of a housewife. Sharon spent the next year trying to land even larger acting roles, but she was continually turned down. Instead, she kept getting really minor parts. Her luck would eventually change in 1965 when she was cast in a major role in the film Eye of the Devil. The filming of this movie took place overseas, and at the close of the movie, Sharon decided to stay in London. She was making a name for herself in the fashion world there, and she often frequented the nightclubs and really enjoyed her life in London. Things were really going well for her at this time, especially because this is when she met Roman Polanski, who would later become her husband. Roman was the director, and he and Sharon initially weren't too keen on one another. He eventually cast her in the movie, however, she wasn't his first pick, and he was really impatient with her at first because he didn't feel like she was a very strong actor, and it took her multiple takes to get the scenes right, and he just really didn't have the patience to work with her. He initially had wanted a more established actress in the role, but after a while, Sharon began to grow as an actress, and this really impressed Roman. This role really helped Sharon gain more confidence in herself as an actress and as a person. Eventually, Sharon and Roman moved in together, and Sharon's former boyfriend, Jay Sebring, traveled to London to meet Roman. Although he was devastated because he kind of felt like he lost the woman that he loved, he and Sharon still remained really close friends, and he grew to like Roman. Sharon returned to the United States, where she starred in the movie Don't Make Waves. However, she's been quoted saying very negative things about this movie and reportedly did not care for the way that she was portrayed and depicted in this role. Later on, Roman joined her in the US, and Sharon acquired a few more acting roles. Sharon was not known at this time as a serious actress. No one really took her seriously, and they kind of just saw her as this beautiful woman who didn't really have a lot to offer as far as acting went. She was often criticized for appearing nude in different films and magazines. When the media spoke about Sharon, they never gave her any positive recognition. It was usually pretty negative. Sharon's career wasn't taking off in the way that she had hoped, and so in January of 1968, Sharon and Roman were married in London. The couple didn't exactly have the perfect marriage. Roman did not remain faithful to Sharon and would often remind her that she agreed not to change him once they got married. All along, Sharon hoped that Roman would change, and that just seems like such a sad place for a woman to be in because, of course, it never works that way. But I just think that she loved him and wanted to believe that they could have this perfect traditional marriage. But I don't think that Roman was willing to give up his lifestyle for Sharon. Sharon would often tell people that she and Roman had a perfect arrangement because he would get to lie to her and she would pretend to believe him. It sounds like such a toxic situation, honestly, and I think that Sharon really deserved better, but I almost feel like because she grew up so insecure and never really learned how to have confidence in herself, she just settled for this. Sharon and Roman moved to LA, and they became part of this really tight-knit circle full of people who were all really successful in Hollywood. And this included different musicians, actors, directors. They had this really close group of friends. Roman told Sharon that he wanted to be married to a hippie, not a housewife, and they often had tons and tons of different people in and out of their house because Roman wanted it to have this free spirit kind of vibe. Sharon said that she didn't mind because she thought people should live and let live, but a lot of people are actually really critical of how lax Roman was when it came to allowing strangers into the house, especially since he was gone a lot. In 1969, Sharon starred in the movie The Wrecking Crew, and unlike her prior roles, she received a lot of praise for this one in the media. She was even nominated for a few different awards, such as the New Star of the Year Award and the Most Promising Newcomer Award. At the end of 1968, Sharon got pregnant with hers and Roman's first child. She and Roman moved to 10050 Cielo Drive in LA. This was what Sharon called her dream home, and that makes it even more tragic that it would only turn into a total nightmare for her. Before I go into the horrific events that happened on the night of August 9th, I want to talk about the backstory of the friendship between Terry Melcher and Charles Manson, because this relationship, and particularly the end of this relationship, is really what led to the gruesome murders that would take place. When people got news of the murders of Sharon Tate and her friends, it was really alarming because they couldn't imagine who would want to target her. However, it turns out that the attack wasn't specifically set against Sharon or any of her friends, but instead it was an attack on anyone who happened to be inside the residence of 10050 Cielo Drive on that evening. It all stems back to the prior resident of the house, Terry Melcher, and his relationship with Charles Manson. Terry was friends with Sharon and Roman, and that's actually how they acquired the house because he had lived there previously. So when he was ready to move out, he put a good word in for them, so they were able to lease it from the owner. Terry was a musician, and after working as part of a duo, he later went on to join the Beach Boys. Another member of the Beach Boys, Dennis Wilson, introduced him to Charles Manson. Dennis Wilson knew Manson because Charles Manson and his family members, which are really just the cult members, but they're known as being called the Manson family, so that's what I'll refer to them as. So Charles Manson and some of his family members were currently living in Dennis's house, and Dennis knew that Manson was into music, and so Dennis introduced him to Terry. Terry ventured out to the ranch to meet Charles Manson because Manson wanted to play some music for him and see if maybe they could get some kind of record deal. But after playing some of his music for Terry, Terry refused to sign him, but he had mentioned the possibility of making a documentary about Manson and his family. But after a later incident where Terry witnessed Charles engage in a violent altercation, Terry totally abandoned that idea, and this caused both Terry and Dennis to sever any ties they had with Charles Manson. After seeing how violent he could be, they decided that they didn't want any part of that, and their friendship kind of fizzled out. This really made Charles Manson pretty angry because in his eyes, this man had come to him and he was hoping to have a music career somehow and, have this documentary made, and then that all got taken away from him, and now there were these two men that just didn't want anything to do with him anymore. So that kind of pissed him off. So after Terry decided not to speak to Charles Manson anymore, he moved out of the house in February of 1969, and that is when Sharon and Roman moved in. In March of 1969, Charles Manson was seen trespassing on the property, and he was confronted by a photographer who was there to photograph Sharon. This was a month after Terry had moved out, and there were times after the murders that Terry said that Charles did know that he didn't live there anymore, but then he kind of went back and forth and said that Charles didn't know that he lived there. But I think it was confirmed that Charles Manson did in fact know Terry no longer lived there. And so he orchestrated the murders as kind of a message to Terry. He never actually was after Terry himself. He wanted to kind of send this shocking message to him. So Manson is trespassing on the property, and this photographer confronts him and asks him what he's doing there. And Charles says that he is looking for Terry. And the photographer had no idea who Terry was. And he told Charles that Terry no longer lived there, but he suggested that Charles go down to the guest house that was on the property and see if the tenant of that house could maybe give him some information. Sharon was really uneasy after seeing Manson, and there was something just off about his demeanor to her, and she just did not get a good vibe after she saw him. A little while later, the photographer and Sharon both saw Manson leave, and he and Sharon both were just very confused by the whole thing, and they didn't understand why this man was on the property, and they both just had this uneasy feeling about him. Later that evening, Charles Manson showed up once again, and he went straight to the guest house, and while he was there, he actually was confronted by the owner of the property, and Charles asked the owner if he knew where Terry was. The owner could kind of tell that there was something off about Charles, so he gave him some false information and told him that Terry had moved to Malibu. The next day, Sharon asked the owner of the property if, quote, that creepy looking guy had returned to the guest house later that evening. Sharon was really bothered by Manson's presence, and it was something that really stuck with her. Something I want to briefly talk about is really interesting, actually, and that is that Sharon did an interview, and in that interview, she stated that she had almost like a premonition or a vision 2 years before the murder took place. At the time of the premonition, Sharon was staying in J.C. Ring's home, and the house had a pretty dark history because the prior tenant had actually committed suicide inside of the home after his partner ended their relationship. So Sharon was having a really tough time being in that space, and the energy just wasn't sitting well with her to begin with. So she went to bed, but she was really struggling to fall asleep. And this is when she had her vision. In the vision, Sharon said that a creepy little man entered the room that she was staying in and began to chase her. She ran near the stairs, and that's where things just got even creepier, because as she approached the stairs, Sharon said that she saw someone tied to the staircase, and she wasn't sure if it was her or Jay, but someone was tied to the staircase and their throat had been slashed. So it's really interesting, especially when we go over what happens to them later on, that she had this kind of vision, and I imagine that would just be really terrifying. So Sharon kind of, I don't want to say lived in fear, but she never forgot this vision that she had. So on the night of August 8th, and technically the murders happened after midnight, so Sharon and her friends were killed on the 9th, but on the evening leading up to that, August 8th, Sharon had some of her friends over. Roman was in London at the time, and he was supposed to have already returned home, but there was a delay in his travel plans, so Sharon was rightfully upset about that. She was almost 9 months pregnant, and she probably just wanted her husband home with her. But she was alone, so she had 2 of her friends come over for lunch. And then later in the evening, Sharon went out to eat with Jay, her friend Abigail Folger, who was actually the heiress to the Folgers Coffee Company. And, okay, don't come for me. I looked up how to pronounce this. Apparently the pronunciation video is wrong because in the comments so many people were very upset about how this was pronounced. But it's Wojciech, I think that's how you say it. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. I'm so sorry if I butchered that. Wojciech Frykowski. So the 4 of them finished their meal and they returned to Sharon's house around 10:30 p.m. Also on the property that night was a young man named Stephen Parent. He was 18 years old at the time, and he was visiting the tenant of the guest house because he wanted to sell him an AM/FM radio. So as Stephen was visiting the tenant of the guest house, this is when Tex Watson, one of Charles Manson's followers, and 3 young women snuck onto the property. It was around 11:30 at night, and Stephen got into his car. He was driving towards the exit gate of the property, and he had stopped so that he could push a button to open the gate. This is when a dark, shadowy figure moved towards him, and it was Tex Watson. Tex and the 3 women had been sent to the house of 10050 Cielo Drive, and they were instructed to kill anyone in it. Tex was accompanied by Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel. Tex had driven himself and the 3 girls up to the property, and when they heard Stephen's car approaching, Tex instructed the girls to lay down in the bushes to avoid being seen. He approached Stephen's car by himself, and he began attacking Stephen with a knife. In doing so, he severed many of Stephen's tendons, and all while this was happening, Stephen was pleading with Tex not to hurt him. Tex shot Stephen 4 times in the chest and abdomen, fatally wounding him. After this, Tex and the 3 women pushed Stephen's car out of sight because they didn't want to draw any attention to themselves. From there, Tex, Susan, Linda, and Patricia all walked up to the main entrance of the house, and they started looking for a possible way to get inside. They searched for open windows and doors until Tex eventually cut the screen to one of the windows. Susan climbed through, and then she went to the front door, and this is where she let the rest of them in. Linda Kasabian stood outside keeping watch, and so she didn't actually partake in any of the murders. Wojciech was asleep on the couch, and he was awoken by the intruders. He asked them what they were doing there and who they were, and Tex told him that he was the devil and he was sent there to do the devil's work. Susan and Patricia went through the rest of the house, gathering the other 3 people and bringing them downstairs. Sharon and Jay were tied together by their necks and then tied to the banister of the staircase, which is so creepy. I don't even know how I feel about that because that almost perfectly lines up with Sharon's premonition. Jay was the first one to be shot because he was really upset at how they were treating Sharon because she was pregnant, and as he defended her, he was shot. Tex then went on to stab Abigail 7 times, and Wojciech had managed to break free because he was only bound with a towel, and so he managed to get out of that, and he ran out of the house and onto the lawn. But unfortunately, Tex caught up to him and he stabbed him 51 times, which is just total overkill and so horrible. They definitely wanted these murders to be shocking. Abigail also broke free for a little bit and she ran out of the house and into the pool area. However, she was eventually captured again and she was stabbed another 28 times. And then all while this is happening, Sharon is pleading to the killers and asking them to spare her life long enough for her to give birth to her child. She offered herself up as a hostage, telling them that they could keep her until it was time for her to give birth and then they could kill her, which is just so devastating that even in her time of death, she was just thinking about the safety of her baby that she would never be able to meet. But the killers just did not care, and they felt that they were there to carry out specific orders from Manson, so they didn't care how much Sharon begged and pleaded. They eventually killed her anyways. It isn't exactly clear which one of them killed Sharon, and from what I've seen, Susan has said that it was her, but then Tex said that Susan never laid a hand on Sharon and that it was all him. So I'm not really clear on which one of them actually did it. But what is known is that Sharon was stabbed 16 times, and 5 of these stabbings alone could have been fatal. Later on, Tex revealed that Sharon cried out for her mother while she was being murdered, and that is just such a heartbreaking thing to hear. I can't even imagine, and it's just so sad, especially since she was pregnant. And yeah, I don't even want to get into that too deeply because it is really just so sad that her baby died with her, and the last thing she said was mother. It breaks my heart. After they had carried out the killings, there was one final thing that Manson had instructed the killers to do, and that was to leave a sign at the crime scene that would get everyone's attention. And so they painted the word pig in Sharon's blood right on the front door. And this is said to be a symbol of the racial war that they believed would be following these murders. So the following morning, Sharon and Roman's housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, arrived at the home, and that is where she found the bodies. When police arrived on scene, the first body that they discovered was Stephen Parent's, and as they moved closer to the home, they found the bodies of Abigail and Wojciech. Inside, Sharon and Jay's bodies were found tied together. There was one survivor of the murders, and that was the property caretaker who lived in the guest house. This was the man that Stephen Parent had been visiting, which was the reason he was on the property that night. The man who lived in the guest house was named William Garretson, and police questioned William, and he told them how Stephen had come to visit him and left around 1:30, but that was the only information he knew. He didn't hear anything else that happened, and he hadn't seen anything that happened that night. So police took him in for questioning. However, when William agreed to take a polygraph test and that test came back and cleared him, the police let him go because they no longer believed he had any involvement in the murders. Roman returned home after hearing that his wife had been murdered, and police questioned him as well. However, he was across the pond, and he really didn't know anything. And later on, Roman was interviewed by Life magazine because they had done a pretty large piece on the murders, and they showed all of these pictures of the crime scene. And one photograph that was really controversial is a picture of Roman standing next to the front door and it still has the word pig spelled out in his wife's blood. And he received quite a bit of backlash for this, but Roman defended his actions, saying that he did it because he believed that if he put out something shocking, it would inspire someone to come forward with any information they might know. Which I kind of get, but at the same time, I just could not imagine being photographed next to something like that. I don't know, I feel like I would want it removed as soon as humanly possible. But I guess I don't really know what I would do in that situation, so I don't want to judge. I just think that it is kind of weird. After her death, Sharon's prior films were re-released, and of course they were vastly more popular now, which is really unfortunate, but that is what tends to happen when someone passes away. Suddenly everyone is interested in them and their work, but it's just very sad that no one really seemed to appreciate Sharon as an actress while she was alive. Photos of Sharon were leaked into the media, and it was speculated that she was murdered because of an involvement she may have had with some satanic organizations, but that was later debunked because those photos were actually taken on the set of her movie Eye of the Devil. Friends and family had no idea who could have wanted to hurt Sharon because she was known as being such a sweet and kind person. They couldn't imagine her having any enemies, let alone an enemy who wanted to kill her. These murders really shook up Hollywood, and it even led a lot of people to move out of the area. At the time, they didn't know if there were killers walking around amongst their inner circles because they had no idea who killed Sharon and her friends. The people who did stay in the city, they all hired bodyguards, and there's just this overwhelming feeling of fear in the community because it isn't often that you hear about rich and famous people being attacked. Usually we tend to think of people with a certain level of income and fame as being untouchable, but Sharon's murder proved that this just was not the case. The murder of Sharon and her friend caused a lot of people to really panic. However, soon that panic would be eased slightly, because just a few weeks later, members of the Manson family were placed under arrest because of their involvement in other unrelated crimes. This led to a huge breakthrough, especially on the Tate case, and Manson, along with 26 members of his cult, were arrested. Charles, Susan, and Patricia went to trial for these murders, as well as other crimes. They caused quite a disturbance over the course of this trial, and the three of them were eventually given the death penalty. Susan showed no remorse for Sharon and stated that she enjoyed killing her because she was so sick of Sharon begging and pleading and pleading and begging. Tex had fled the state, and he was currently in Texas at the time of his arrest. He eventually faced his own trial, and he was also sentenced with the death penalty. Sharon's mother, Doris, spent the rest of her life advocating for victims' rights. She made it her personal mission to see to it that none of the people involved in her daughter's murder would ever be able to seek parole. Sharon's father preferred not to make any public comments in regards to his daughter's murder, but he was also known for fighting alongside his wife in an effort to preserve victims' rights. Roman was utterly destroyed after the murder of his wife and unborn child, and he's definitely a controversial person, but I do have to feel for him as someone who had his entire life ripped away. He sold all of his possessions and moved because he couldn't bear to be around anything that would remind him of what he had lost. And I honestly don't blame him. I probably would do the same thing. What happened to Sharon was definitely a tragedy, as well as the other victims. She was so young, and she was about to become a mother, and her film career was finally about to take off. It's just so sad because we will never know what the rest of her life could have looked like. There's so much to cover in regards to the Manson family, and I will probably cover that on a future episode because I do want to go more in depth. So you can look forward to that in the future. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed the first episode of the Unshadowed podcast. Please rate and review this podcast if you'd like, and with another episode. And until then, I'll see you in the shadows. A like. I'll be back next Thursday